Who gets the benefit of fear? Children are supposed to be innocent. That's the deal. That's the promise. That's why we protect them, excuse them, give them second chances, tell them they have their whole lives ahead of them until they're black. Then something strange happens. A 12-year-old becomes a young man. A teenager becomes physically imposing or aggressive. A child is labeled as a threat. And suddenly, innocence comes with terms and conditions. According to researchers at Georgetown Law, black children are often perceived as older, less innocent, and more responsible for their actions than their white peers. Older, less innocent, more culpable. Sit with that. Public perception sees threat where it should see childhood, and suspicion where it should see innocence. The same country that says childhood deserves protection has often struggled to see black children as children at all. And when society stops seeing a child as a child, eventually that child begins to understand it, to anticipate it, to live around it, to survive it. Because our children don't just fear danger. Our children fear their own fear. They learn that fear can be misunderstood, that fear can be held against them, that fear can make them look suspicious instead of vulnerable, aggressive instead of afraid. And that is a burden no child should have to carry. So let's ask a question America has been avoiding for a long time. If we don't see black children as children, what exactly are we seeing? And what happens when those perceptions enter a courtroom? What happens when they enter a police report, a prosecutor's office, or a jury of 12? Because self-defense just isn't about what happened. It's about what people believe happened, what police believe, what prosecutors believe, and what those 12 jurors, who are supposed to be of your peers, but are oftentimes not, depending on who you are, believe. Because the law doesn't simply ask whether a person was afraid. It asks whether that fear was reasonable. And history tells us that America has never agreed when deciding who's dangerous, who's threatening, who's innocent. Tonight, we're talking about self-defense. We're talking about fear. We're talking about perception. And we're asking a question that sits at the heart of justice itself. Who gets the benefit of fear? Welcome to You Ought to Know Better. I'm AJ Miller. This is the podcast where we read the fine print, check the receipts, and investigate the asterisk. Let's start with the question. Not the legal question, the human one. Who gets the benefit of fear? Because I think most of us assume we know the answer. Everybody. Right? Fear is fear. A frightened person is a frightened person. The law is supposed to be blind. Justice is supposed to be blind. Rights are supposed to belong to everyone. At least, that's the promise. But promises and practice aren't always the same thing. And nowhere is that gap more visible than in conversations about self-defense. Because self-defense isn't really about violence. It's about fear. A person says, I was afraid. And the legal system responds. Should you have been? That question changes everything. Think about how strange that is. Two people can witness the same exact event and walk away with completely different conclusions. One sees danger, the other sees an overreaction. One sees self-defense, the other sees aggression. One sees fear, the other sees an excuse. Same facts, different interpretation. Because fear isn't measured, it's judged. And human beings are doing the judging. Police, prosecutors, judges, jurors, the court of public opinion, people with experiences, people with assumptions, people with blind spots, people with an obscured view of history, whether they realize it or not. And maybe that's where we should start. History. Because America has spent a very long time deciding who should be feared. Not just through laws, through stories, headlines, politics, repetition. If you hear the same story enough times, eventually it stops sounding like a story and it starts sounding like common sense. And common sense can be one of the hardest things in the world to challenge. Because most people don't even realize they're carrying it. After the Civil War ended, slavery ended. But America's obsession with controlling black bodies didn't. Black codes emerged in the South. New laws, new restrictions, new pathways into the criminal justice system. Convict leasing. States leasing prisoners to railroads, mines, farms, private businesses. The names changed. The uniforms changed. The justification changed. But the question remained, who belongs? Who deserves protection? Who deserves suspicion? Who gets treated as a citizen? And who gets treated as a threat? That question never really left. It followed us into the Jim Crow era, into segregation, into the, quote, tough on crime era, into the war on drugs, into modern policing. Different century, same conversation. Who's dangerous? Almost anything can be justified in the name of safety. More surveillance, more enforcement, more punishment, more suspicion, and a hell of a lot less grace. That's why I keep coming back to that Georgetown study. Not because it's shocking, because it explains so much. Researchers found that black children are often perceived as older than they actually are, less innocent, more responsible for their actions and choices. Think about that. Not adults, children. A child walks into a room carrying the expectations of an adult, the consequences of an adult, the suspicion reserved for an adult. And then we act surprised when the outcomes look different. Because childhood is supposed to be a shield. It's grace, it's patience, it's protection. It's the benefit of the doubt. It's the assumption that mistakes are part of growing up. But what happens when that shield gets taken away? What happens when public perception sees threat where it should see childhood? Suspicion where it should see vulnerability? What happens when the child who needs protection becomes the person others believe they need protection from? That's not just a social question. It's a legal one. Because eventually those children grow up. Eventually they encounter police officers, prosecutors, judges, jurors, and laws that ask a deceptively simple question. Was the fear reasonable? And now we've arrived at self-defense. Not through a legal definition, again, through a human one. Because before self-defense is a law, it's a feeling. It's the moment your heart starts racing, the moment your stomach drops, the moment your brain tells you something is wrong. The law doesn't create that moment. It only tries to judge it after the fact. And that's where things get messy. Texas courts have recognized that when evidence raises the issue of self-defense, juries should be allowed to consider it. In cases like Dyson v. State and Warner v. State, courts reinforced an important principle. If evidence exists that could support a defensive theory, the jury should hear it. That sounds fair. And honestly, it should. Because rights don't mean much if people aren't allowed to assert them. But getting a self-defense instruction and winning a self-defense argument are not the same thing. Because evidence still has to be interpreted. Fear still has to be interpreted. And interpretation requires people. That's why researchers have spent decades studying perception. Researchers like Joshua Carell and Jennifer Eberhardt found that race can influence perceptions of danger. Not always, not in every situation, not for every person, but often enough that researchers kept finding similar patterns. And that should make us uncomfortable, not defensive, uncomfortable. Because it is fear that is the foundation of self-defense. And if fear is the foundation of self-defense, then perception matters more than we'd like to believe. So to make it practical, imagine two people walk into a room. Before either person says a word, your brain has already started making assessments. Safe, unsafe, familiar, unfamiliar, threatening, not threatening. Humans do this constantly. It's part of survival. The problem is that survival instincts don't always distinguish between perception and reality. And when those perceptions are reinforced by centuries of stories about who is dangerous, those split-second judgments can have long-term consequences. And if perception influences how we see people, shouldn't we expect it to influence how institutions interact with people too? Researchers with the Stanford Open Policing Project analyzed more than 100 million traffic stops across the United States. 100 million. And what they found raised difficult questions about who gets stopped, who gets searched, and who gets viewed with suspicion. The Department of Justice found similar concerns when it investigated Ferguson, Missouri. Black residents made up about 2/3 of the population, yet they accounted for the overwhelming majority of stops and arrests, about 94%. Now, statistics don't tell us everything, but they do tell us where to start asking questions. And these numbers raise a question that should sound familiar by now. Who gets the benefit of fear? Because over-policing isn't about one officer, one traffic stop, one department. It's about exposure. More contact, more stops, more searches, more opportunities to create suspicion. And if one community experiences dramatically more law enforcement contact than the other, should we expect identical outcomes? No. The same question appears when we look at incarceration. America is home to roughly 4% of the world's population, yet houses around 20% of the world's incarcerated people. One nation, 1 out of every 5 incarcerated people on earth. That didn't happen because Americans suddenly became 5 times more criminal. It happened because of choices, policy choices, political choices, legislative choices, choices often made in the name of safety. And don't get me confused. Safety matters. It matters a lot. Every parent wants their child to be safe. Every community wants to feel secure. Every person wants to get home at night. The question isn't whether safety matters. The question is what we're willing to sacrifice to achieve it. And who pays the price when we get that calculation wrong? Because sometimes the price is measured in years. Sometimes it's measured in freedom. Sometimes it's measured in wrongful convictions. According to the National Registry of Exonerations, innocent Black Americans are significantly more likely to be wrongfully convicted of murder than innocent white Americans. Sit with that. Sound familiar? Sound like something that we recently experienced? Not guilty people getting harsh sentences. Innocent people convicted, imprisoned, sometimes for decades. Those cases force us to confront something uncomfortable. The justice system is made up of human beings. Human beings with opinions, flaws, biases, and human beings who are capable of making mistakes, sometimes life-changing ones. Which brings us back to where we started. Children, fear, perception, humanity. Because I don't think this conversation is really about self-defense. Not entirely. It's about recognition. The ability to be seen fully. To have your fear recognized. Your vulnerability and your innocence acknowledged. Your humanity seen. Because when a society struggles to see your childhood, it will often struggle to see your fear. And when it struggles to see your fear, it may struggle to recognize your right to defend yourself. A society that sees threat where it should see childhood will inevitably struggle to recognize that child's fear. That's not a political statement. That's a human statement. Children are supposed to be innocent. And that's where we started tonight. And that's where we're going to end. Because public perception has a habit of seeing threat when it should see innocence. And suspicion where it should see vulnerability. Danger where it should see fear. Our Black babies shouldn't have to fear their own fear. They shouldn't have to prove their innocence before they receive empathy. They shouldn't have to prove their humanity before they receive protection. And they shouldn't have to grow up wondering whether the world will see them as children before it sees them as threats. Because childhood is not something that should have to be earned. And innocence is not something that should have to be negotiated. I'm AJ Miller, and this has been You Oughta Know Better, the podcast where we read the fine print, check the receipts, and investigate the asterisks. Good night.